Who is the man of the shroud? This is a central question, and it's a question that we need for our own Christian lives. The Holy Father, St. John Paul II, once wrote, "There is no Christian holiness without devotion to the Passion, just as there is no holiness without the centrality of the Paschal mystery." And so this is really a question for our own holiness, and we need the Passion to be center in our spiritual lives. In this tour of the exhibit, Who is the Man of the Shroud, here in Rome, we want to dive deep into these central questions. What did the man suffer, and why did he suffer it? And so we look with the eyes of a tourist to see through this museum the different elements that unveil what our Lord endured for our salvation. But we also, with the hearts of pilgrims, ask the deeper question, which is, why, Lord? Why did you endure all this for me? And so what I want to invite you to do is to do a virtual tour with me. Join me through a Lenten journey right now through the desert to the light of the resurrected Christ. Come on, let's go. Our virtual tour and our Lenten journey can begin here in 1898 with a man named Secondo Pia. He's the one who went down in history as taking the first photograph of the shroud, and something spectacular was discovered. Here we have an image of the face of the man of the shroud as it appears on the shroud in normal light. It's what's called the positive image. But Secondo Pia, snapping the first photograph and going into the dark room to develop the film on a glass plate inside of a solution, saw for the first time this image. It's what's called the photo negative. It's where the grayscale is inverted, where the white turns to black, the black to white. And what he discovered, to his shock and surprise, is that it's no negative at all. The negative is the positive. And this is, of course, mind-boggling. Why should it be that the shroud itself is the result of photography, 19 centuries before the invention of photography? Here, for example, you have a picture of the first dactylographs, those early cameras first invented in around the year 1840. This is just about 60 years later, and we're photographing with the brand new technology of the day, the Shroud of Turin, an ancient cloth, which was believed to be the relic, of course, the most prized relic in all of Christendom, the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. And so, what a privilege if we have the chance to contemplate the face of our Savior. Could it be that that's what Secondo Pia was looking at? Well, isn't it interesting that the shroud should be a negative image, what has been called a photographic document, where this grayscale is inverted, where black turns to white and white turns to black to reveal the true image, the deeper, more important image. See, Pope Benedict XVI, in one of his reflections before the Shroud of Turin, said precisely this. He said that it's like it really is. That is to say, the darkest mystery of our faith is at the same time the most luminous sign of never-ending hope. So when we look to the shadows, we should, with eyes of faith, see the other side, the negative that is, in fact, the positive. Isn't it fascinating that we call Good Friday good? It's the day that we put God to death. It wasn't just homicide, it was deicide. And yet, this was the day of our salvation. That day truly is good for those who have eyes to see. So let's look with the eyes of a scientist, and let's look with the eyes of a pilgrim. But we're just getting into the beginning. Imagine if we have more technology, not just dactylographs and cameras. What if we were to put the most state-of-the-art equipment to study the shroud? What then would we find? Well, follow me and let's see. All right, let's fast forward from 1898 to 1976, when a very important new discovery is made. First, we learned that the shroud, unlike any other document, acts as a photonegative, and it contains a flawless, anatomically flawless image of a crucified man. But now, we're going to study not with just photographs, not with cameras, but with the most state-of-the-art equipment of the United States Air Force Academy. This is Eric Jumper and John Jackson, and they're using the VP8 image analyzer to study the photonegative of the shroud. And so when they slip that image under the VP8, what do they find? For the first time, they visualize the three-dimensional qualities that are encoded in the cloth. You heard me right. The cloth, which is, of course, flat, two-dimensional, contains 3D information, but information we could not see until 1976. Well, that discovery will mobilize what is called the Shroud of Turin Research Project. That is this elite team of the most highest powered laboratories across America that petitioned the royal family, the ones who own the shroud, in order to study for 5 days, 120 hours, exhaustively but non-invasively, the Shroud of Turin. And here we're talking every area of science is of interest. So physics, chemistry, biology, X-ray, infrared, ultraviolet, pyrolysis mass spectroscopy, microscopy, flower samples, and so much more. And their only question is this: what formed the image on the shroud? That image which is so unique, unlike anything else. It's in a photonegative. It contains 3D information. Well, what in the world is it? Is it a painting? Is it a rubbing? Is it a scorch or some ancient form of photography? Well, this team of scientists is bound to figure out that question. But you know what? They go to study only to come back home with more questions than they have answers, because to this day, it remains an open question. We don't know scientifically what formed the image of the shroud. And that leaves room for faith as well. And so I want to bring us now closer to the shroud itself and see what this enigmatic and mysterious image is all about. So far, we've seen why science is interested in this image which bears a very unique image of a crucified man, which is a photonegative, which contains three-dimensional information. But the scientific community isn't the only one interested in the shroud. Above all, and for long centuries, it was the Christian community that was interested in the shroud because it was what was discovered here in that empty tomb. That is, the body wasn't there. That's why we call it an empty tomb. But if we're honest, it wasn't completely empty, was it? There was a burial cloth inside, and that's what was discovered. That's what we read about every Easter Sunday when we take up that passage from John chapter 20. And I want to revisit that with you now. So this is the central passage that comes from John chapter 20. And you know the story, right? Because it's Mary Magdalene who wakes up early in the morning, but not early enough. She gets there and the body is already gone. And so she races to go tell her friends, Peter and John, the beloved disciple. And as soon as they hear the news, they race to the tomb. And who gets there first? Well, it's the younger and faster John. But he doesn't go in. He waits for Peter outside the tomb. And it says here in John chapter 20 that he bent down and he saw the burial cloths. That's the first mention of this key word in Greek, othonia, which we sometimes translate linen cloths, or here, the burial cloths. But he's seeing from a distance and he's bending down because, as you can see here in this model, that there's a stairwell that is in front of a sliding, rolling stone that allows access into an antechamber. And then here at the far end, you see a sill where you would have the body laid. And so there would be the burial cloths, presumably. And so why would you bend down? Well, to get a better angle, to see deeper inside, right? If you're standing tall, you're not going to see much inside. So it makes sense, this gospel detail, that he bends down. But when he sees, notice this. It's a particular verb. It's the verb blepo. Well, that's one way to say the word to see, But there are other ways, and John is going to use that to communicate a theological message. Watch what happens next. In verse 6, Simon Peter arrived after him, that is, the beloved disciple. And he went into the tomb, and he saw the burial cloths. But guess what? It's a new verb, because this time he's seeing more closely. He's there inside the tomb. He's descended that stairwell. He's moved past that rolling stone. He's inside the tomb, and now he's seeing the burial cloths there and the cloth that covered his head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. Can I just pause for a second? Because the evangelist just mentioned 3 times the word burial cloths, the word shroud, we might say. And you're saying, well, where are we going with this? There are so many details that I would love to know about Christ's passion, and the Gospels don't record them. But all of a sudden, when it gets to the dirty laundry that's lying on the ground, the evangelist wants to tell us every dirty detail. Why? We can't know unless we read the next verse. And here we find, in verse 8, the key passage. Then the other disciple also went in, the one who arrived at the tomb first. And he saw and believed. Well, what did he see so that he believed? Would you know that it's not that initial verb, blepo, John saw from a distance in a first moment, nor is it the word theoreo. That's the verb to see, which is applied to Peter when he goes in and gets close to the cloth. But now, in the third moment, John, when he saw and believed, it's not blepo, it's not theoreo, it's horao. He sees in a new way, in a supernatural way, we might say, because he saw and believed. Again, what did he see so that he might believe? And believe what? Believe that Christ is resurrected to new life? Just from the small data that some dirty laundry is lying on the ground? John, how do you get to that conclusion, right? I wish I could jump into a time machine and reproduce what he saw. Of course, we can't do that. But what we can know is this, that it was the condition of the empty tomb. It was what he saw and the way that he saw it that suggested something to him, that said something new has happened. The first baby steps towards belief in distinctively Christian faith. Christ is risen. And this, of course, will be confirmed in the apparitions that come next. But what I want you to notice is that our Christian faith, which is founded on testimony, so too began with the silent witness of a simple cloth lying inside a tomb. See, the shroud speaks, but it speaks in a different language than human words. And when the disciples discover this cloth, this is when they begin to believe. And so we've got work to do, don't we? We've got to look with the eyes of a scientist. Yes, we've got to observe like Simon Peter did, and even John the disciple from a distance. We've got to discern certain scientific, empirical facts about the cloth. But our work isn't done when we've done that work. We've got to then ask the bigger question, right? The bigger question is, well, what does it mean? What does it reveal? Who is the man of the shroud? Let's bring that question now to the shroud itself. We come at last before the shroud itself, and we want to look with the eyes of a scientist and the eyes of a pilgrim, or in the words of St. John Paul II, faith and reason. Faith and reason are like two wings by which the human spirit ascends to the contemplation of the truth. Well, what does faith reveal and what does reason reveal? Let's begin with the latter. We have, of course, a very large garment, 14 feet wide, 3'7" in height. This is a gigantic cloth. That tells us something. It tells us also, among other things, that it's a very pricey linen. It's something that would have cost a lot of money. And so one of the first and most obvious questions you've got to ask is, why is this man, who is so brutally tortured and so brutally treated before he dies, why is he treated as royalty when he's laid to rest, when he's buried in the tomb? See, what we read about in the scriptures is that Jesus is both hated and loved. Some despise him, and they're men in power. But some also love him, and they're men with means. Do you know that it's Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both men who pertain to the Sanhedrin, this authority, this authoritative body in the Jewish community that is going to provide for the burial of Jesus. And so what we see here on this shroud now is, above all, four marks that I think the scientist should observe. And the first of these might be this obvious burn pattern, right? So you see these symmetrical triangles, don't you? And that's because the shroud was folded up in such a way that when the fringes of that folded cloth were singed and burned, well, these symmetrical patterns are what appear now when you unfold that cloth. So we have signs of fire. We also have signs of water. These are water stains that you see here and here. And you can see that the symmetry is very similar to the lines that we see represented in the fire marks. So we know that this cloth and this image was exposed to heat and to water, and yet neither heat nor water washed away or burned away that image of the man. Third, we see blood. This is very obvious at various positions on the body, at the bottom of the feet, of course at the hands, at the wrists, and here at the side of the chest, and then along the forehead and at the nape of the neck, the small of the back, signs of blood. This is going to be studied by scientists. By the way, 3 different laboratories, two studies in the United States, Heller and Adler. Here in Italy, Baima Bologna studied these same blood stains to find out that this is human blood, right? This is actually the blood of a man and not a woman, we know. We also know that certain qualities about this blood, such that it was shed after death in this particular blood stain. So many signs that point to the authenticity of the shroud. But I want to just point out it with broad strokes, these 4 marks. Do you remember what they were? Fire, water, blood. What's that 4th image? The 4th image, and perhaps the most important, is the body image. The body image is what's going to be most studied. Remember, what's the central question for the scientist? What formed that enigmatic image that is a photonegative and that contains 3D information? What is it? Where did it come from? Well, what do you observe as a scientist as you zoom in close to those fibers on the cloth? And what you'll notice is that this image is ever so faint, ever so superficial. How superficial? Well, imagine a human hair. Imagine you had a pair of scissors and you cut that human hair in half. And then with what remains, you did that experiment again and again. Do that 4 or 5 times until what remains is 1/16 or 1/20 the width of a human hair. We're talking 1/5 of 1,000th of a millimeter. That's how superficial the image is to the cloth. If I could image that, imagine that you had in my hand a bunch of straws, and that represents the cross-section of a single thread. Well, what is colorized on the cloth? Not the whole thread, but instead just 1 or 2 straws along the outer edge. And it doesn't penetrate to the medulla, to the center of the fiber, but just the outer rim. Such that if I had a razor blade now, and I just gently scraped it across the top of the cloth, I would erase forever the image of the man. That is how superficial it is. Did you know it's even more dramatic, the explanation, if I were to take a light bulb? If I were to move to the other side of the cloth, do you know that you would see the blood perfectly? Because that blood is soaked into the fibers of the cloth. But do you know what would happen to the image of the man if I had that light bulb on the other side of the cloth? You wouldn't be able to see the image at all, because the light would simply overpower. It's that subtle, it's that faint and superficial. And so whatever the shroud is, I want you to know this: it's not a painting. There are no pigments, organic or inorganic, no dye, no brush strokes, no varnish whatsoever, no directionality with which any type of pigment is applied to the cloth, like any other artwork would be. The bottom line is this. This is what the scientists conclude in 1978. The Shroud of Turin Research Project comes to the conclusion that the shroud is not artwork. Well, then what is it? What produced this enigmatic image? This remains an open question. We come to the most important part, perhaps, of this virtual tour, this journey towards Jesus and his death and resurrection. We want to look now at the physical sufferings of Jesus and see what they were and what they mean. Where does the passion begin? This is a question that is often overlooked. We think of Good Friday, the carrying of the cross and the horrors of Calvary, but we forget often that it really began on Thursday night, after the Last Supper, when Jesus already offered his life sacramentally at the table, and then he went to pray, and he entered into the agony. Do you know it's Luke, the physician, who records this detail? Jesus, he prayed so fervently, and he was in such agony that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, we can't see on the shroud, to be fair, any signs of sweating blood. We can't see signs of what took place on Thursday night, except for the arrest and the way those soldiers and the way those people who came with their torchlights and their clubs treated him. Because as we look to the face, what we see is inflammation on the cheeks. We see, according to the American scientists, a broken nose. If we were to come 2/3 down the nose, a separation of the cartilage, that is, the septum, is separated from the nasal bone up above. And this means that, according to the American scientists one more time, that there was a club of about 1.5 inches in diameter that was used to strike the face. And that's interesting because the Gospels record that Jesus was both slapped, as if with the hand, but he was also struck, as if with a club. Again, this coincides with what we see on the shroud. The fact that there's inflammation in the body is also significant. Because, if you were to strike me right now, we wouldn't see swelling right away. But come back 24 hours later, and sure, you would see signs of inflammation. Now remember, the shroud records the image of the man as he was laid in the tomb. That means some 24 hours later, not Thursday night, but Friday evening. That's when the cloth is in contact with the body. And it coincides with what we read about. Well, why is Jesus struck? And by whom? Do you remember the circumstances? Well, what happens is that Jesus is arrested, and then he's brought to the Sanhedrin. But stop for a moment and ask the question, how did he get there? How did these soldiers know who to arrest? Do you remember the sign that Judas had arranged with those soldiers? He said, "It's the one that I kiss. That's the one you need to snatch." And so with a nonchalance that's absolutely chilling, Judas approaches Christ in his prayer. And he says, "Hail, Rabbi," with, I'm sure, a big smile. And then he greets him with a kiss. But with that kiss, he conveys this message: I hope you die, right? Because this is the first step in a chain of sufferings that ends in death. And so, appropriately, that kiss registered in his body as physical pain. Because do you know that one who suffers hematidrosis, that is, the sweating of blood, and I should explain more explicitly that hematidrosis occurs, it's when the smallest blood vessels in your body, the capillaries, become distended and they burst, and now exiting out of the sweat glands, which are immediately adjacent to those to those capillaries with their nerve endings, out comes bloody sweat, leaving the biggest organ in your body, which is the skin, now sensitive to touch. And so anything, just to touch, to breathe over the surface of the skin, according to some reports, would cause pain. And so this kiss of Judas, which ought to have been a sign of love, a sign of affection, becomes a sign of betrayal. And so Jesus is arrested, brought before Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin. And it's Caiaphas, the high priest, who rends his garment when Jesus says, "I am." That's the response to the question, are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? And Jesus says, in that circumstance, I am. And so the first blows to Jesus' face. The blasphemy is so scandalous that they strike him. And this is what we have to contemplate here, isn't it? That when you see this face so bruised and battered, the reason they struck him is not going to be told through the microscope. That you've got to go to the scriptures for. The reason they struck him was for the confession of who it is he said that he was. I'm the Christ and the Son of God. Do you know, it's when it was least convenient to say such a thing, Jesus quotes the most clear messianic passages of the Old Testament. He quotes Daniel 7, 13 and 14. He quotes the Psalms, Psalm 110. I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of the Father. You think that's a good time for Jesus to make such an announcement? When he had nothing to gain and everything to lose, he lays it all out at last. This is who I am. I'm the Christ and the Son of God. And this is what unleashes the fury of the passion. This is what leads to death. And this is what we ought to contemplate when we see this bruised and battered face. So Caiaphas, the high priest, says that Jesus is worthy of death, but he doesn't have the power to put Jesus to death. And so he carts Jesus off to Pontius Pilate, who surprisingly will say 3 times that Jesus is innocent. There's no cause in him. Therefore, I shall have him scourged, Pilate says, with lots of logic, right? And what a scourging it was. We see on the shroud images that are not only on the back, not only in that just upper region of the body. In fact, it's head to toe, front and back, that we see again and again these signs of a Roman scourging. It's not a Jewish flogging, which was with mere straps or leather cords, right? But now we have lead balls, it seems, that, as you can see imaged here in this model of a Roman flagrum. This image is going to appear over 360 times, according to a certain John Jackson. That number might be slightly less according to other authors. But can you imagine? We're talking about 120 lashes if we understand that there are 3 cords attached to one flagrum. This is excruciating pain that is going to leave bruise marks all over the body. And each one of those bruises is comparable to a 3rd-degree burn as far as the damage that it does to the body. And we could debate whether or not they actually broke the surface of the skin and led to bleeding, but that doesn't even hardly matter, because you could fall off a motorcycle and be laid up in the hospital for 6 weeks without shedding a drop of blood, but I can guarantee you, you'd be in lots of pain. This is just the preambles of the Passion. We're going to see that Jesus is going to carry the cross. He's going to be, of course, crowned with thorns. After all of this, that is after the agony and the hematodrosis that left his skin sensitive to touch, now 120 lashes, head to toe. And you know that in addition to all of that is the fact that Jesus is stripped naked. It's not just a physical suffering then, but there's a spiritual and moral suffering. That Jesus is being mocked. Jesus is being humiliated in a public way, stripped naked. We know this because the scourge marks are just as deep in the pelvic region as everywhere else on the body. There was no protective loincloth when he was scourged. What a humiliation. Now we've got to stop, we've got to pause at the observation of science to then move beyond what science sees to ask what this all means. And there the scripture is going to help. And you can remember that it was Adam and Eve who were naked without shame in the beginning, weren't they? Why would Jesus enter into such sufferings? Do you know it's St. John Paul II who talks about the original nakedness of Adam and Eve, how they were naked without shame? Well, isn't it the fact that Pontius Pilate and the enemies of Christ want to humiliate and shame Jesus? And willingly he enters into these particular pains and this type of ridicule. Jesus is the new Adam. He doesn't heal us from afar. No, he steps into the knot that Adam and Eve tied. He steps into all the consequences of our sin so as to undo them from the inside. He doesn't wave a wand from a distance. He doesn't snap his finger and say, okay, I declare you clean. No, he feels the consequences of our sin, and this is what we've got to contemplate when we look at these wounds, these blows that go from the ankles all the way up to the chin. There are no marks over the heart. Those Romans knew not to kill Jesus by striking him dead these are just the preambles to his suffering. Pontius Pilate, remember, he declared Jesus innocent. He wants to save his life. That's the whole purpose of the scourging. Ironically, because his idea is this: I'll parade him in front of the people. He'll be so bloody and so disgusting that when I say, Ecce homo, behold the man, behold the king, they'll cry out, enough, let the guy go home. But they don't. They just cry out all the louder, crucify him, crucify him. And so Pontius Pilate washes his hands and says basically, have your way with him. And so Jesus is now sentenced again, this time to death. So this tells us some important things about Jesus prior to the carrying of the cross. He's already brought to the brink of death with these powerful sufferings of the Roman scourging. But it doesn't stop there. Jesus is now going to be mocked further with a crown of thorns. And so we can see on display here that crown, a crown which is not just a ring around the ears that leaves the top of the head exposed. No, this is more like a helmet which covers the entire surface of the head. And this, of course, is where there's a great concentration of blood vessels. And so, not surprisingly, there's a great concentration of blood stains, especially around the rim that now terminates at the nape of the neck over here. This is what's imaged on the shroud, a great pooling of blood, indicating some 30 or 50 wounds, probably caused by thorns of about 3/4 of an inch long. You can see the model of the plant here, the Ziziphus spina Christi. That very term in Latin means the thorns of Christ. And this is imaged here before you. Can you imagine? The forensic doctors tell us that these thorns penetrated not just the skin, but all the way to the bony plate below. And so, what sufferings? But we've got to go deeper and say more than just, ouch, right? There's a meaning behind this crown. What are they doing by giving him a crown of thorns, if not mocking his kingship? Oh, you're a king? Kings need a crown. There's a moral suffering beyond the physical one. And beyond the moral suffering, there's also a theological message. Jesus is a king, but he's not a king as earthly rulers, as Gentile lords. He's not one who lords it over his subjects. He's rather one who lays down his life for his sheep. This is what Jesus would say, isn't it? In John chapter 10 and verse 18, he says, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." I've got the power to lay it down. I've got the power to take it up again. So Jesus isn't suffering as a victim whose circumstances are beyond his control. He's stepping right into these sufferings. He knows exactly what's coming, And there's a purpose to it all. Well, what's the purpose of a crown of thorns? I think what Jesus is saying, without even opening his mouth, but simply by wearing this crown, is he's saying, I am the King of Kings. I am the Lamb of God. Why was he saying I'm the Lamb of God? Well, you got to know your scriptures to see this. Where does thorn first appear in the scripture, if not in Genesis, as a consequence of Adam's sin? Because you've listened to the voice of your wife and eaten of the fruit of which I told you, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you. It shall bring forth thorns and thistles. Did you know that thorns and thistles are the consequence of sin? And therefore, they're a metaphor for sin. This we know that Jesus was aware of because he used that exact same language in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, beware of false prophets. You shall know them because you'll know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns? Are figs gathered from thistles? What Jesus is talking about when he mentions thorns and thistles is moral evil. Again, sin. When he's talking about figs and grapes, he's talking about moral good or virtue. And so Jesus is aware that thorns are a symbol of sin. He knows that he'll be wearing thorns in his own passion. What he's saying, once again, without using words, is this: I am the sin bearer. The sins of all the world are laid upon me. I bear them in my passion. Let's now look to the carrying of the cross and Christ's death as we move to the thorns, or rather to the nails. The Gospels record that Jesus carried his cross to Calvary. Now, is there any evidence of that on the shroud itself? There is. And what we see is that there's an excoriation on the right shoulder, and then on the left shoulder blade, closer to the spine and a little further down, indicating that the man of the shroud carried the horizontal beam, what's called the patibulum. And he carried it on his right shoulder such that a third of the weight was in front of him and about 2/3 of the weight was behind him. And when he changed his position or when he fell, this is what scraped against the left shoulder blade. Now those excoriations, you have to remember, those abrasions, those scrapings, are occurring after the hematodrosis, after the brutal scourging. And the weight of the wood would have been somewhere around 75 or 125 pounds. Can you imagine carrying such a thing and not falling? It's certain that he fell, it seems, because, well, we have this tradition in the Catholic Church in the Stations of the Cross that he fell once, twice, and a third time. But where do we read about in the scriptures 3 falls? We don't. But on the shroud, wouldn't you know that there is evidence of a fall because there is dirt. There's a residue on very particular places of the body, namely under the foot, at the knee, and yes, at the tip of the nose, which makes perfect sense because if your hands are tied or bound to a chain gang, to remember that Jesus is crucified with a man on the right and a man on the left, it's very likely then that there would have been cords to band together this group of bandits as they marched towards their death. And so perhaps Jesus didn't have his hands free in any easy way so as to brace himself when he was inclined to fall. And fall he would, to his knee and eventually flat on his face, with a crown of thorns, and on top of that, 75 or 125 pounds of wood, crushing down upon those thorns, pressing those thorns into his scalp and into his skull. I can imagine what it is to get up from such a fall. I can imagine what would motivate you to get up in the first place. But Jesus would get up once, twice, and a third time. Now, do you know that the scientists can study that dust, that dirt, and they say, according to one geologist, one scientist will say, that it matches the dirt of the grottos of Jerusalem like a fingerprint. That is, we know that it's composed of calcium carbonate with just a touch of strontium. We even know its crystalline structure is travertine aragonite, which is a very rare crystalline structure. Again, matching the very dirt of that area of Palestine. And so this is significant because, some naysayers would say that this isn't the shroud of Jesus. No, this was fabricated in France centuries later in the Middle Ages. Well, then what then is it doing with, Palestinian soil right there in those points of contact, the feet, the knees, and the nose? Just those areas that stick out and would be prone to contact with the ground. So Jesus gets up and he marches all the way to Calvary, and that's when those soldiers will drive in the nails. 9-inch nails with a square cross-section that go right through what's the destats space that is in the wrist, right at the junction between two nerves, the ulnar nerve and the median nerve that connects, of course, through the central nervous system all the way to the brain. This is what Jesus is going to feel for now, 3 hours, 6 hours? We don't really know. Jesus, of course, is crucified somewhere at that time, maybe around 10:30 in the morning. We know it's between the 9th hour and between 9 a.m. and between 12 a.m., as it records in the scriptures. And we know that there's a loud cry of Jesus at 3 p.m., after which he dies. And so for at least 3 hours, he's hanging on the cross. But remember, before he could ever be mounted up top, first on the ground, he was in this position, with his hands stretched out at 90 degrees. And then he's hoisted up, plopped down on top of a vertical beam, which was already planted in the ground. And now his arms sag some 25 degrees, and all of the weight of his body is hanging on those two nails. And it's not until a third nail is placed through both feet that now this redistributes the weight of his body. And so when his lungs are burning and he's gasping to exhale, what must he do to breathe out? Well, he's got to press down on the nail in his feet, and he's got to pull up on those nails in his wrist and twist in such a way, as you can see behind me, so as to create the space for his intercostal muscles to relax. And now he can breathe out at last. But how long can you hold that position before you are tired and you fall once again? And so Jesus will have this ongoing struggle as now the pleural cavity fills up with fluids and compresses the lungs, making it more difficult to breathe, more arduous for the heart to pump, and eventually his life will end. But not before he prays some 7 times. I can assure you, if that was me on the cross, I wouldn't say a word. If it took that much energy just to breathe. But instead, Jesus is going to be praying, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." He's going to be praying for the very people who are torturing him in the moment of his greatest pains. And so he'll even shout out with a loud voice, "Into your hands, Father, I commend my spirit." And then he breathes his last. It is finished, right? And he hangs his head and dies. And we know that he dies, by the way, because as you can see on the image behind me, on his right side, between the 5th and 6th ribs, penetrates a Roman lance, a wound of about 4 centimeters with a double-edged blade that gives a kind of almond-shaped wound. This is a distance of about 3.5 inches to the heart. Out flows blood and water, says the evangelist, which is exactly what the scientists are able to discern only with modern instrumentation, because it's with ultraviolet fluorescence that we see how the serum is separated from the corpulous red blood. This is something that's not visible to the naked eye, but modern science picks it up, and it coincides exactly what John the Evangelist records. This is not blood that was flowed out while the victim was still alive. No, it's post-mortem blood. And this coincides exactly with the gospel message. And what is the revelation? What is the theological truth that is conveyed there? That from the side of Christ comes the bride of Christ. This is the new Adam giving birth, as it were, to the new Eve, which is the church. And how do you enter into the life of Christ if not through the water of baptism? How are you fed and nourished with the life of Christ if not through the Eucharistic blood? And so the fathers of the church have always seen in this fact that outflowed blood and water, well, this is the birth of the church. We enter into Christ's own life and death and resurrection because of what he did in his own flesh. So this is not just his mystery, it's ours too. We are imaged right here in this blood and water that flow out, a sign of the life that is divine that we receive, though we're simply human. And so, yes, Jesus did die. This is sure because of the wound in the side, at the very least. So from the shroud, we know that Jesus died. But do we know from the shroud that Jesus also rose? Let's look at that question next. We've come to our final station, and we have to talk about the signs of resurrection. I won't say proof of resurrection, because I don't think there is proof of the resurrection in and of itself. I think instead the resurrection is a dogma of faith, and so we believe that. But the reason we believe it is because it's reasonable to believe. So what are the signs that suggest that Christ rose from the dead on the shroud? Well, there's two things in particular. The first is rigor mortis. The second is what I'll describe as fibrinolysis, and I'll explain. Rigor mortis is that cadaveric rigidity that sets in after death. The body is really hard on the shroud, and we know this because the head is raised, as the position of Christ while he was on the cross was that his head was hanging. So when he's in the horizontal position, he maintains the position while on the cross. That is, his knees are bent while hanging vertically. Well, so they're elevated when Jesus is lying in a now horizontal position. And so also we see that in the buttocks, they're particularly curved. They're not pressed flat like fingers against a window pane. And so this also suggests that Jesus is in rigor mortis. Why didn't the body relax? Why didn't it putrefy or decompose? On the shroud, we see no signs of decomposition, no signs of putrefaction anywhere on the shroud. Why wasn't there ammonia gas exiting out of the nose and mouth, obscuring the facial image? That didn't occur, as you can see. So instead, we see that despite the rigor mortis, that only lasts for 40 hours, and then the body begins to change its shape, its position, its appearance. Because we know we didn't reach that point, it tells us that the body was separated from the cloth before the 40-hour mark. Well, what explains this separation, if not the resurrection? At least that's what the Gospels record. But there are no signs of, vandals, robbers wrenching the cloth off of the body. That would presumably leave signs of smearing or smudging. But this didn't occur. Instead, we see that the bloodstains at the forearms, for example, this is dried blood that is now acting as glue, pegging the cloth to the body, and yet, when the body is separated from the cloth, there are no signs of displacement, of smearing. And so this suggests that fibrinolysis was interrupted before the 40-hour mark. Well, how did this take place? Why did the blood stop soaking into the fibrils? Obviously, there was a separation of the cloth from the body. And this, of course, Christians have an explanation for. I don't know, I can't prove it to you, but I sure know this, that where science offers no explanation, we know it's not a rubbing, it's not a scorch, it's not a painting, and it's not an ancient photograph. What is it? Science can only shrug their shoulders, but Christian faith offers an alternative solution. The fact is that Christian faith reveals that Christ rose to new life. And so, I don't know what you contemplate when you look upon this serene face, but I know what I think about. If I had suffered on the cross, there's no way I would have looked as peaceful as this. But it's a message to me of the love that Jesus poured out for each and every one of us when he offered his life in order that we might know everlasting and eternal resurrected life. And so we contemplate our own mystery, our own destiny, when we look to Jesus, who took upon our nature to die in our flesh and blood, but he also united our nature to his divinity. And so it's the resurrected glory, ultimately, which we contemplate in this beautiful, peaceful face. I pray that God may bless you in your ongoing contemplation of Christ's passion, death, and above all, resurrection. Because it's not just his story, it's ours too. God bless you.